Hi, everybody. So hopefully the post-lunch malaise has worn off. You've got some energy back. If not, I encourage you to have more caffeine and carbs. I'm probably going to move around a lot just because I'm very animated, so that's a little bit of forewarning. But yes, as you've heard, I am Heather Hershey, and I am an analyst from IDC. And you may be asking yourself, if you've never actually talked to an analyst one-on-one, what is that? What do you actually do? Well, in this case, I give keynote speeches, but in general, what I do is I interview vendors, I interview buyers, I interview systems integration firms that are small in scale and global, to try to figure out in commerce where the bodies are buried, who's actually got the goods, what's hype, what's real, what's signal, what's noise. So I'm going to unpack some of that for you today, hopefully, within this particular talk track. We're going to talk about the 5 top themes that I'm perceiving in digital commerce, but the one thing that we're going to talk around, it'll be kind of a through line with all of these themes, but is not the actual trend, is agentic commerce. And that's because my suspicion is you've heard a lot about that already. You probably already know also that this is kind of an ambiguous term that will be one of those things where if you ask 10 different people, what does this mean? About half of them will go, huh? And then the other half will give you completely different definitions. So I will contextualize that. I will give you my definitions of these things, but these trends will be around that environment of agentic commerce, but agentic commerce is not one of the main themes. So the first thing I'm going to do, aside from an introduction for myself, is a reality check for commerce in 2026, the market conditions. Wall Street is not the economy. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of product catalog data, which will echo some of the themes that you've heard earlier today. The importance of payment flexibility, partners, and tax remittance, which is a more crucial part to a lot of these themes than a lot of people might be aware. So let's get into it. Who am I? I am the core digital commerce analyst at IDC. Again, I interview a lot of people, I write a lot of reports, and then I talk about them in public. And so my market, massive. And you may not be able to see from here because this is kind of an older slide. But my market has over 450 discrete logos in it, spread across many different domains of digital commerce, because commerce isn't just about the main Swiss Army knife platforms that we're all aware of, but it also includes things like channel feed management, PIM, order management systems, payment providers, the kitchen sink that you would integrate in a best-in-breed model for commerce. But what you may also know is that this is the 3rd time that I've been asked to come speak here at an event for commerce. Previously, it was for Big Commerce, and now for Commerce Live. And so this is me in the green room preparing last year, and I got to meet Ray Kawasaki backstage, which was pretty cool. But yeah, I feel like since this is the 3rd time, that now makes this a tradition. So let's jump right in. The reality check for commerce in 2026. And by this, I mean commerce, the activity, not necessarily commerce, the company. Today's version of Agentic AI is the least capable version that you will ever encounter again in your lifetime. But even if the current wave, because AI always comes in waves, and it's usually followed by a winter and then another wave, even if the current wave comes short of the shore, the next one will overtake it. The progression is inevitable. So let's talk about the pain for a second, because what is the point of a lot of this AI stuff we keep talking about if it isn't actually going to solve your most crucial pain points in commerce? Well, when we asked commerce professionals, who, by the way, the majority of the respondents for this particular survey, which is our CX Path survey at IDC, the majority of the respondents on the commerce track were B2B operators. So this is a B2B heavy data point. The majority stated that lack of automation was the #1 reason why they perceived that they were losing revenue, followed by problems with their technology platforms. And often what is the case in those situations is that the integrations are not particularly harmonious. It is a tale as old as time. One of the things that I have to constantly reiterate in my practice is that commerce isn't just about building beautiful, pretty experiences, but it's very technical. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. There's a lot of consumer psychology that goes into it. But it is both the front end, the back end, the orchestration layer, and the data. It is a lot of stuff that all needs to be coordinated behind the scenes. And if any of it breaks, it can lead to catastrophic results for the business. What are your key business goals? Well, we asked the same cohort of respondents, and really, it's again a tale as old as time. They want their customers to be happy, so they come back and they keep buying things. It's really just that simple, but it's also just that complicated, because what does it take to really crack that code? Right? It sometimes seems like a Rubik's Cube. How do you actually not only get to the discovery level, get the people onto your properties to get to know your brand, get to know your products? How much of that actually matters in the agentic future that we keep talking about? Because there's a certain case to be made that a lot of that's going to hinge on products alone to the detriment of brand. But maybe not entirely, right? Like a lot of that is up for debate right now. But ultimately, it's challenging to do that funneling action in a really noisy, saturated environment where you don't know if you're actively advertising to bots or people, or if the customers coming into your web properties are bots or people. Are they bots of good faith, bots of bad faith? Do you have the mechanisms to be able to tell the difference? Chances are, probably not. So let's talk about the first trend, and that is that Wall Street is not the economy. Why do I call this a trend? Because it sounds more like a narrative theme, right? Well, I think partially it's because this is a tension point that comes up constantly when I talk about what I do for a living, what I'm studying, and agentic commerce themes in general. Because frankly, we're in a moment where there is, in my opinion, a bit of a bubble. There's a lot of hype and hyperbole going on in the market related to AI. And, companies that have very little in terms of agentic AI are calling themselves blah, blah, blah brand.ai and magically getting a lot of money, all birds. So, we're seeing this happening, and it's so cynical, but at the same time, it's effective. And it's because what sells on Wall Street is very different than what sells on the ground level to practitioners in the field who need to make money selling things via all of this technology. So market sentiment isn't a proxy for IT budgets. They look like they track each other. And that's kind of why I wanted to show this particular graphic. They both go up. Line goes up. Clearly they're related, right? But you can see, if you really zoom in, that there is a lot of gap between where the actual Wall Street narrative is and where IT spending is, right? And the reason why is because these narratives are in conflict with each other. They're very different. The narrative to Wall Street is sci-fi, quasi-dystopian when that works, quasi-utopian when that works. And the pendulum just seems to constantly swing capriciously based on whichever AI firm with that frontier model is doing the talking, right? And I think you kind of know what I mean. You've heard them flip-flop between this is going to be the end of all jobs to, well, AI is not going to replace you. It's people who know how to use AI is going to replace you. And then back to it's going to replace all of your jobs, right? Like, they can't get the narrative straight because they're following a moving target, and that moving target is basically saying, whatever's the most disruptive wins, right? And we're in the land of irrational numbers. Well, IT spending is not in the land of irrational numbers. In fact, it's very rational by design. Like, if you can't actually prove that the thing that you are procuring will result in a return on that investment in a timely fashion, it's going to be a bad day. Right? So we have to be much more practical in commerce when we are talking in the field to practitioners about their actual IT strategies and process design flows, workflows, and more crucially in the context of AI, what is driving the decisions? Because that ultimately should help you figure out, that should be your North Star, about what kind of AI you're actually leveraging for that activity. And I think that this is something that often gets lost in this conversation when we rely on that big bucket umbrella term of AI for everything. AI is an old term, and a lot of shenanigans can happen underneath that big umbrella, right? One of the things that I see most ubiquitously in my practice is the conflation of AI agents and agentic AI. Most of you probably know there is a difference here, but I would argue that many investors don't understand that distinction at all. An AI agent may just be a conversational interface on your website that is pulling product data from your order management systems, your product catalog, etc., your transaction layer. And it is generating an experience for humans to use when they visit your web properties. That is conversational commerce. That may or may not be leveraging agentic AI. And in fact, the only thing that may be agentic about it ultimately is the natural language processing going on the front end, right? Like it may just be what's being supplied by the API connection to the LLM itself, which means that that's not technically agentic commerce because agentic AI is not doing the buying, and more crucially, agentic AI is not making the decisions in that process. The only agentic part of the decisioning that's happening is what word comes next. Commerce tech helps you make more revenue and reach new buyers, and that's impressive even without sci-fi narratives. Because at the end of the day, and by the way, I recommend that if you want to go through all these talking points, get out your cell phone, take a picture. I'm not one who reads all of the text on my slides because whenever people present to me, I find that very tedious. But if you want to keep a record of this, I encourage you, please take pictures and share them. And feel free to tag me. I'm Heather Hershey. I'm on LinkedIn. But the thing that I think is really important here is that, anything that helps you improve your margins, makes your customers stickier, happier to come back, those are wins, right? And that is not really that revolutionary. The thing that is changing are the tools of approach for making that possible, and whether or not you can be on the cutting edge of it, or whether or not that's even appropriate for the model of business that you are in. Because arguably, there's a pretty stark divide between what's really going to be beneficial in a direct-to-consumer B2C context and what's going to be beneficial in a B2B context. And in my practice, I cover both sides of things, so I can see that divergence happening almost in real time. Key takeaways are that stock performance reflects a narrow slice of large global companies. Most Americans have minimal equity exposure, and gains don't translate to broad demand. IT budgets and customer constraints operate independently of market swings. So build your strategy around real customer needs and not what's big and buzzy on the street. I am in a position where I'm talking to vendors all the time who are caught in between both worlds. And trying to navigate both of those worlds in their go-to-market pitches is quite the tightrope walk. They struggle with it. And that's because they need that investor capital to come in so they can keep building up their products and, frankly, survive in many cases. But they also need their buyers to be able to use the things that they're building into those products in the first place, or else why are we here? Trend number 2, product, catalog data, and syndication. Now, if you were here last year, you will recognize that this is a reference that I'm pulled directly from Travis. So if you know, you know. I'm trying to echo that theme, and it is still big and buzzy right now. Product information, channel feed management, and product data that are having a real moment and have been for over a year, as I just mentioned. But why are they so hot right now? Well, that's because there are a lot of predictions going on. Now, this is one from IDC that we predict that by 2030, AI will replatform 500 billion in digital commerce. But I want to highlight a couple points here that I think are very crucial caveats. IDC anticipates that the definitions and surfaces of agentic commerce will continue to shift towards more realistic terrain over time. And what I mean by that bullet point is that the definitions of these things are still being determined. They're being determined by the street. They're being determined by the buyers in the market. And where that definition will land, nobody knows, right? So anyone who tells you definitively that they know what agentic commerce is, they're probably selling some kind of service, or they're probably selling a software product. In my case, I think that these are actively ongoing debates, and I'm happy to hear your perspective if we run into each other outside or something like that. But in my opinion, when we're talking about agentic commerce, that is because an agent, that is AI, is capable of running very sophisticated decisioning loops. So again, what is making the decision is a crucial factor in determining whether or not you're looking at something that calls itself an AI agent or is actually agentic AI. It has to be able to loop through various tools, various data sources, and then crucially determine when to stop that looping mechanism because it's found what it considers to be the statistically most relevant and accurate conclusion point to give you that result. If it is not doing that for the transaction, for the discovery, and potentially some of the routing of the fulfillment, then is that really agentic commerce? I would argue that true agentic commerce has all three of those elements to varying degrees. Does that mean that there aren't humans in the loop? Certainly not. There are humans on the loop monitoring things, and at various touch points, humans within that loop, whether that's a consumer that is staging this agent to be able to do its shopping for them, because maybe they just hate having to filter through that noise manually in online spaces. Or maybe this is a platform that is staged for that. Like you are in an LLM platform and you want to use that to do some of your shopping for you, right? But then the next stage in that is who is actually committing the purchase? Who is actually buying? Are they authorized to do that? And that is where a lot of this is heading. You may have heard a lot of that earlier today throughout various talk tracks, but then you also have to think about the flip side of that, right? Like it's going to be hard to actually figure out how much of this is being done by people, how much of this is being done by bots. And your challenge now and in the future is how do you detect when you are engaging with a bot? And how do you detect when it is not a malicious bot doing malicious activities? Because this is an important point that I want to make really quickly. One of the most challenging things you're probably going to encounter in the future is that you can't just block entire countries to mitigate this problem, particularly if you were engaging in multi-channel, multi-geo commerce, right, with multiple brands, et cetera. Like the more complex your go-to-market and your commerce strategy is, the less viable it is to just block whole cloth IPs and countries, et cetera, to try to get around where you think most of the bots are coming from. And some of those bots may just be normal customers. Like in the future, progressively, you can anticipate that normal, everyday customers are going to be leveraging agents to do things like add a bunch of stuff to the cart and then abandoning it and waiting for a promotional trigger. Because they're doing these things now. They've been conditioned to do these things manually. Why wouldn't they be using AI to augment that behavior on their behalf on an industrialized scale to get the best possible outcomes? Are you as a merchant prepared to engineer scenarios that mitigate that possibility? Because, I mean, I would argue that that's not just a potentiality, that is an inevitability on the D2C, B2C side of commerce. And the other problem is that, again, this has so many different definitions. You can see on one of these examples, agentic commerce is the whole kit and caboodle. It is the discovery, it is the purchase, it is the fulfillment, as I just mentioned. In the middle, it's just the payments layer. The payments are being done via agentic commerce. And in fact, a lot of the buzz this year so far has been coming from payments providers, many of whom are here today. And then also chatbots. As I mentioned, conversational commerce is usually used as a stand-in for agentic commerce, but they're not always the same thing. And in fact, I would argue that just because something is calling itself an agent does not mean that you should feel comfortable calling it agentic AI for the reasons I described earlier. Another thing that's kind of fun, at least from my technical perspective, is that agentic commerce is generally headless. You could perceive that what's going on in the current moment is an extension of the ongoing debate about moduliths, because let's be real, there aren't that many monoliths truly in commerce anymore. Most of them are moduliths. So we've got this debate between moduliths in commerce and the composable systems and everything in between, right? But what isn't really up for debate is that if you want a really robust multi-channel strategy for the future that harnesses agentic scenarios as well as traditional channels that may have more sophisticated search mechanics for discovery, because you can imagine that they're also evolving to incorporate more of this advanced AI, that you have to almost view what you're doing as a headless endeavor by default. And in case you don't know what that means, even though I'm sure most of us probably do, so you're decoupling the front end, the experience layer, from what's going on in the business logic layer, right? So you need to basically create an environment on the back end that no matter what channel you're entering into, no matter what kind of AI may exist in those channels, or if the entire channel is in fact AI, that you're prepared to transact there, that you're prepared to put your product content there, and that you're prepared to engage with customers there, whether they are using AI agents as proxies or they're engaging with you directly. And you need to be able to pivot back and forth fluidly in a transcendent fashion. This is something that I've talked about in many of my talk tracks over the years while I've been at IDC, is this concept of transcendent commerce. Commerce from the customer's point of view that transcends the glass, it transcends the channel. You want to understand where the conversation left off on the last channel and began in the new one, and if they're engaging with you in 2, 3, multiple channels in parallel at the same time because they're using AI to do this on a much broader scale, you need to understand that customer. You need to understand that they are doing that, and you need to understand how to approach them to really get the best possible outcome for all involved. And agentic commerce needs humans in the loop. It needs them. And part of it is because when we talk about agentic commerce, one of the words that comes up pretty commonly, and I often have debates, well, usually with vendors about this, is the word autonomy. And some of you in this room have probably heard someone call agentic commerce autonomous commerce, because it's a go-to-market strategy being leveraged by many of the vendors that I talk to. I'm not going to name names. But the problem with using autonomy in this way is that it's kind of a weasel word, because in the context of AI, autonomy is a range, right? It's not a destination point, right? So to say something is autonomous, your next question should be, to what extent? What's autonomous about it? Right? Like, to what degree of autonomy are we talking about here? Because in most models, even from the frontier model developers, Anthropic, OpenAI, they've gone and published what they consider to be, the maturity curve for AI. And in most cases, they position agentic AI somewhere in the middle or towards the beginning near the middle, right? They don't position it as being, on a scale of 1 to 5, a 5 on a scale of autonomy, right? Because that is AGI. That doesn't exist yet. And that's kind of what these vendors who conflate this terminology are hearkening to. They're hoping you will make that association and frankly allow them to conflate agentic AI and AGI. AGI is sci-fi. And thank goodness for that, because I like having a job. So strengths and weaknesses of generative AI. Strengths: it's great at producing text. It's great at producing code. It's great at producing images, because guess what? All those things are very digital, and it ingests all that stuff as yummy, yummy fuel for its models. And that's what it uses when it is generating novel outputs. But what it's weak at: complex pricing logic. Understanding human incentives and behavior. If you're familiar with Anthropic's Project Vend from Q3 of last year, then you probably understand some of the limitations of how well agentic AI does or does not perform when it is trying to negotiate prices with buyers, even in highly controlled environments. And even though AI is advancing at a rapid pace, that part is not advancing quite as quickly, because it involves the touchy-feely, squishy human incentives component of things, which is much harder for the AI to understand, because it would need to take in more contextual signals from outside of digital environments to truly comprehend. Because as you and I both know, when people go into online spaces, it's not really an authentic representation of who they are. It's a curated version of who they are. And even if they are habitual oversharers, they're still performing in those spaces. So it's not a true representation of what's going to motivate them to buy something, just as an example. And then also, it lacks moral reasoning. I mean, it could probably debate you on Socrates, and it could probably have really robust philosophical conversations based on the inputs that it has taken into its modeling. But that doesn't mean that it understands morality. It understands right or wrong. It understands what's going to cost you money or customers. So you can't really rely on it at this stage in the game to make mission-critical choices where customers can see. And agentic commerce needs structured product data, is the point of this particular part of the talk track. and it needs you to supply it. Now, the good news is that you can use AI to augment your product catalog, to enrich it, to make it more ready for syndication into these various channels for discovery. And that's great. But you should also recognize that there is a very real distinction, as I mentioned earlier, between syndicating these things into conversational commerce channels, whether that's going to be something like WhatsApp or your own sort of conversational chatbot on your own website, or if you are dealing with an agentic commerce scenario, which is what I mentioned earlier. The bar is much higher there. The AI is making more decisions in more places. It's more sensitive. There are more security considerations to keep in mind. So in some ways, the other is probably going to be a little bit better for most of you. The conversational commerce is a safer bet because it is a helpful thing to stage. It's just not this gigantic sci-fi revolution, right? Like, we've been talking about chatbots for commerce for a really long time. And if you were really curious, you can look into it. There are quotes from like 2016 where the CEO of Microsoft is talking about how, conversational commerce is basically going to destroy websites, right? So this is a trite and very tired narrative from my perspective. I think that brands are still going to want to stage their own websites and customers are still going to want to go there, right? But I do think that having a really nice companion for guided shopping experiences or for helping with common customer service issues, having that chatbot interface there can be really, really helpful for them and provide a better experience. But when we're talking about the compression of the customer journey in terms of commerce, we're talking about agentic commerce doing that, right? It's not going to be a chatbot specifically that is doing that. So understanding these distinctions is very important. Product data is everything. We asked in the same CX Path survey, this time to professionals who had a lot of critical exposure and were working professionally as merchandisers within PIM systems. We asked them, what kind of impact does syndicating your data into multiple channels actually have on your business? And it's a profoundly positive impact, right? So you can see here that, most of the respondents stated that either they got a moderate uplift in conversions or they saw a pretty big change. And that is something you don't really see in data to the kind of questions we're asking. The results aren't usually this significant. If you've ever seen one of the charts from IDC, you'll see that, in fact, some of the ones I showed earlier, let me see if I can go back just a second. You can see when I show some of these charts, well, it's not in here, never mind, that the data all looks relatively same because we're asking the respondents so many generalized broad questions and giving them carefully chosen, considered potential responses is not an open-ended sort of thing. And therefore, when they answer, their answers are all very similar across the board, and then we have to kind of eke out what the significant through line is between the topmost responses. I digress. We also asked what the average product return rate across channels was to try to draw that through line between the product catalog data and what actually happens with returns. And honestly, the results were mixed. In some cases, in some markets, for example, in APAC, you can't see it here in this data set, but in this survey, we surfaced that, depending on what was being sold, that actually having better CX, having better product data resulted in more returned merchandise. Why? That's anybody's guess. But in most cases here in the West, returns are a genuine pain point, and providing better product data can actually provide a slight amelioration of returned product rates. Now, I say slight because a lot of what you're seeing here in this particular data point is conditioned. Consumers in B2C contexts are conditioned to buy a lot of things and return a lot of things and not really feel too bad about it one way or another. So again, think about what would happen to that on an industrial scale if the consumer were using AI to make all those purchases. and to commit to all of those returns? Would that actually make the return rate go up or down for you? Payment flexibility is trend number 3. And that's because friction prevents people from placing their orders. And the more they have to think about it, the less likely you are to be able to capitalize on impulse buys, particularly in a B2C motion. It pays to give consumers access to their favorite payment options, right? Conversion rates go up. And particularly if you offer things like buy now, pay later apps, consumers, for better or for worse, need more flexibility in payments to be able to buy the things they need, particularly during peak periods for shopping, such as, Mother's Day and Christmas, obviously, and the holiday season. And then the average order value also goes up when you enable those solutions. But kind of keep in mind that buy now, pay later can also be a little bit of a double-edged sword. If, for example, you have robust sales during peak periods, Black Friday through Cyber Monday, and you realize that a large proportion of your customer base is leveraging buy now, pay later, pay attention to what that does to their purchase rates for the 3 months after that, right? Because they have to pay back that buy now, pay later, right? So if it has a sizable impact, you may want to consider that as part of your strategy. The same is also true in B2B commerce, though it manifests in a slightly different way. You'll win more deals. Those deals will be larger and they will be faster to close if you offer the kind of payment mechanisms that your buyers are actually interested in leveraging. Now, that does include maybe some of these cutting edge agentic technologies, right? Like one of the primary use cases I keep hearing floated around is this notion that you can have agent to agent, A2A, agentic commerce kind of smooth through repeat purchases and stuff like that. And I've heard stuff like that echoed in some of the talk tracks here today. That sounds pretty cool. Will it replace things that are tried and true like EDI, ACH? I would argue not, because there are reasons why those things are sticky. And usually it has to do with minimal risk, right? And that the rates aren't as expensive for very large volume transactions. So I guess we'll just have to see where the tea leaves play out here. But in my opinion, this will become another tool in the arsenal. It will not be the tool that replaces them all. Trend 4, tax remittance. You know, there are many, many truths in life. There are 2 certainties. One is shaking off this mortal coil, and the other is tax. And taxes and compliance are the killer of multi-channel, multi-geo commerce ambitions. And it's because it's complicated. It's really complicated and it's high stakes, right? Like, you don't want to get a surprise tax note from any government anywhere in the world saying, hi, you owe us several hundreds of thousands of dollars because you didn't notice this loophole over here or whatever, right? You didn't check this box, you didn't submit this form. I mean, there are so many ways where this could go wrong. And so because of that, it's really important to recognize that you need to get your tax strategy right for e-commerce purposes. It's only going to get more complicated from here, right? Like that to me is the scary part. Is, I remember when I first got into e-commerce as a practitioner, this was in a pre-South Dakota v. Wayfair world. And that halcyon era when I could just sell stuff and not have to worry about sales tax. Those days are gone. and I remember it, and it was so easy compared to now, right? That's why you need to partner up with apps and firms that are familiar with this stuff, because it can be complicated all the way down to the individual municipal level. And that's not even considering taxes outside of the United States. It's just we have a particularly tricky tax environment here, to the extent that many major commerce platforms don't want to handle it natively, right? They may be able to handle it natively in countries with VAT, but they have a difficult time doing it here in the States. And this is also a pretty big reason why, in my opinion, ChatGPT did away with instant checkout. And I want to talk about this for just a second. They basically stated that it was because of data fragmentation. And my opinion of that is Well, strategically, they should have known that going into it. The data for commerce has always been like that. And so, there are certain environments, like I would say mainland China, where perhaps it's not as big of a problem because, their e-commerce apparatus nationally grew up mobile first, right? So they kind of got to, skip the crawl of the crawl, walk, run, and they just went running. But that's not the way it is all over the world, where they already had a certain level of maturity in their e-commerce ecosystem. That data is fragmented, the businesses are fragmented. A lot of what goes on for B2B discovery, for example, is locked up somewhere in an ERP. And God only knows how old that ERP actually is, or how many ERPs there are for some companies, right? Because, what I was just outlining is a very simple scenario where there's only one. Most of the companies I talk to on the enterprise level have many ERP systems. And so it's a fractured environment in terms of the data infrastructure and the availability. And OpenAI, I think I realized a little bit too late in the game that, they could probably try to nudge B2C merchants who have a little bit more digital maturity, just generally speaking, as a cohort, to engage in this exercise and to, make sure that their product catalogs were fit for syndication into their ecosystem and had the right sort of, protocols in place and things of that nature. But I don't think they really thought it all the way through about, in a post-South Dakota v. Wayfair world, how much of that merchant of record liability they would be taking on. And you'll notice that in a lot of these frontier model companies, they love to talk about how the merchants get to maintain their merchant of record status. Well, that is one of the things that they are hoping, right? Like they want to make sure that they don't have to get their hands dirty dealing with the taxes, dealing with disgruntled customers, being liable for any of the hallucinations that led to a faulty purchase of the wrong product for the wrong reasons. But they would be closer to liability and responsibility for those things the closer they get to being the merchant of record. And I think the closer they got to that revelation, the more they wanted to distance themselves from being direct participants in commerce. So I'm waiting to see if I'm wrong about that, but so far the signals are all kind of pointing to that speculation being at least somewhat correct. The company still had not built by 2026 the foundational systems required to calculate, collect, and remit U.S. sales taxes, and they could not get past the fact that native transactions were being turned immediately into a regulatory liability. So they turned to their partners who already were absorbing that responsibility to do that on their behalf. And they're focusing almost exclusively on discovery. Now, there's this ongoing conflation in commerce between discovery and commerce. Like, where does one end and the other begin? Part of that compression and the problem it presents in the customer journey is, those things get a little bit closer to each other, right? But they're doing fundamentally different things. And I think that that is the division that is still worth paying attention to, because you may still have to consider channels, and I do consider them channels, like ChatGPT and Perplexity, as places where you are syndicating product content. But I would argue that the bigger prize is still Google, right? Like, most of that search is being replaced by OpenAI stuff that I keep hearing. The numbers don't bear that out. What I see most people using OpenAI products for is generating content, generating pictures maybe. When they want to generate code, they go to Claude. And, I think that that is still very much the case. But it's really important to recognize that you need to be able to syndicate your product content into any of these channels as they emerge. So if Anthropic puts their hands up and goes, hey, we want to become a shopping platform too, be ready to turn that on. And the best way to do that, harkening back to the earlier point, is to have your product data right. Marketplaces, again, OpenAI didn't want the responsibility of being labeled a marketplace. Before 2018, the Supreme Court didn't really put their thumb on the scale, and afterwards, They basically had to back away from this notion that e-commerce websites were just marketing, that they were just billboards to help you reiterate the sort of things that would pull people into the store. The ruling allowed states to tax remote sales based purely on economic activity. And the facilitator trigger is that if you're listing a merchant's products and you're directly processing the payment, you're a marketplace. So as these AI companies get closer to it and then distance themselves, pay attention to what parts of that they wanted and what parts they didn't want. Because as much as I hate to state it this way, that tells you where your opportunities still are, where you are sticky, where you're not going to get displaced, where they need you. And I think that that needs to be a louder talking point in this day and age. And I'll kind of go through this really quickly. I mentioned a little bit earlier, but there's an asymmetry to the audit exposure. By processing payments natively, OpenAI would absorb direct multi-state audit exposure and severe financial penalties for any tax miscalculations. So this was an immense compliance risk on their part. And I think that had a lot more to do with them backing away from direct commerce and being an Amazon competitor than any amount of data fragmentation. Trend number 5, commerce relies on partnerships. A lot of the stuff that I mentioned earlier does echo that theme because it takes 2 or more to make a thing go right. You have to make sure that if you can't do something well, that you have either technology or partners in place that can do that for you. This is one of the things I love about being a commerce analyst in particular. It's that we are the generalists of the tech world. We have to know a lot of things about a lot of different domains of business. We have to know soup to nuts. We need to know about inventory and routing orders and the payments layer and the IT infrastructure to hook all this stuff up. We need to know about technical content strategy as well as the kind that pulls on people's heartstrings. We need to know a lot of things all at the same time. And if you're in B2B, you have to understand relationships, right? And how to perpetuate those very intimate relationships where it is, whether that's one-to-one or one-to myriad stakeholders within an organization who have a say in purchasing decisions. But either way, a lot of this is still based on partnership. It's based on relationships, and it's almost healthy to view your customers as partners in this as well. But from a technical standpoint, you may need help with the taxes, with the payments, with fraud and risk mitigation, your catalog management as it evolves, because you're going to need multiple strategies for multiple channels and multiple iterations of your product catalog for all of it. And then also search and discovery. So here are my recommendations for tech buyers. There's a lot here. So treat product data as the spine for commerce. And I'm not just saying that because of the importance that a company like Commerce puts on products like Feedonomics. It's because in a world where the glass is constantly shifting, the way that you engage with your customers is constantly evolving, the one thing that you can really count on is that you're going to need to have good product data. So it's a pretty safe place to invest and to really make sure that you get it right. So for now, audit product data, define and enforce a minimum viable taxonomy at the bare minimum. Assign a single owner and governance model for product data. Like, I would highly recommend not ruling the catalog by committee, at least when you're setting up the master. Deploy wallets and buy now, pay later. Remove top checkout friction points. Map the tax nexus. Select and begin implementing automation solutions for any of that can be automated. And inventory your partners, eliminate overlap, and clarify roles. In 6 to 12 months, I don't want to read all of this, but you can kind of see that a lot of this strategy uses the now as the foundation to then branch out. But the goal, again, is to, it's a tale as old as time. I used to say the same thing when I was talking about composable commerce and the benefits of headlessness. It's literally the same thing here. You want to make sure your data is right, and that you are creating a contextual structure for that data to be serviced well in AI environments, which means having access to things like MCP becomes very crucial. You may have access to multiple MCP servers across your entire commerce stack. Then figuring out which ones to use, which ones you don't need to use becomes part of that package. what are you actually putting on your product detail pages to actually feed into AEO, answer engine optimization, because contrary to the current narrative of the zeitgeist, no matter how clean your product data is, those answer engines are not reading them. They're not reading your product catalogs. What they want is to find the solutions for informational intent queries, which means you have to basically put like mini FAQs on the PDPs so that way those agents have something to work with when they are generating answers to informational intent queries. So again, know what kind of strategic pathway you want to travel on. Keep it flexible. Don't get too married to a single AI channel, because that is like building a house on quicksand. What you need to do is build your house on your product catalog and the informational context layer of how that information is surfaced. And that is also, by the way, where most of your brand information needs to go, because the AEO is not pulling from that more emotional content about your brand. It needs to get that via more informational responses than just, this brand is really great and we make you feel good. So that is about it for me. I'm Heather Hershey from IDC. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I wish you all a lot of success on your commerce journeys. Thank you.